Today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between being an adoptive parent and being a biological parent. Obviously, I can only speak to my own experience. We don't have biological children, but I have many friends and family who do, and I've witnessed the bond between the parents and the kids. So I know what a biological parent-child relationship looks like, but obviously, again, I can only speak to what's personal for us. So let's start with similarities. Obviously, you're a parent. Being a parent is a parent. You love your kids unconditionally. You have pride when they do something that's really incredible, or even just the small little things. You have this pride in you that I had never experienced before I had children. My son had hydrocephalus, and so he had post-hemorrhagic hydrocephalus, which means that they expected there was something that caused a hemorrhage in his brain, which caused hydrocephalus. And so he had to just have a drain done to remove the fluid, and not a stint, which is the thing that's sort of permanently in a child's head to help drain the cerebral spinal fluid. His was just a one-time drain, and we have to monitor it, keep up with it. But basically, it was really causing severe developmental delays for him. And so when we first met him at the orphanage, he was about a year old, but he was the development of maybe like a 4-month-old. So he really didn't have any muscle development. He had no teeth yet. So obviously he couldn't chew. He couldn't put any weight on his legs. He was always in pain. And so he was really, really developmentally delayed. So my husband and I we weren't planning to adopt. That wasn't our intention. We just thought we would help to try to get him the medical care he needed so that he would survive and start to thrive. So we took him for a surgery in a place in Uganda called Mbale. It's Cure Hospital, which is an incredible organization. And they did the surgery for him, and they removed the fluid. And shortly after that, even when he was in the orphanage, he started to develop a little bit. He started breaking some teeth. He started being able to bear a little bit of weight on his legs. He started being able to hold himself up a little bit more. But it wasn't really until he came home. I will get into our story as time goes, but basically, we found out no one was really interested in adopting him. No one had ever expressed interest in him internationally or domestically. And so when we found that out, even after his surgery, we had already fallen in love with him. And when we found out there wasn't any Ugandan family to take him, we went through the process to adopt him. And so anyway, so he came home first, and my husband had to go back to Canada to work. So I was at home for the first 4 months alone with my son. And it was incredible, those first couple months, to witness him go from this, basically, by this point he was about a year and a half, approximately. We don't know his exact age, but approximately a year and a half. But developmentally, he would have been around a 7 or 8 month old. And within those first few months, he really caught up, and he started taking steps, and he started making sounds to try to speak. He started breaking more teeth. He came home with 3 teeth. In the first 5 months, he had them all. Even his 2-year molars had started to break. It was a lot of just malnutrition as well as development. But every single one of those things that he accomplished, I was so proud of him that I didn't even know it was possible. I have, in my field, I have obtained my doctorate, my PhD, and I was proud of myself when I accomplished that, and I felt good about myself that I had made it that far, but that literally is nothing in comparison to watching my son take his first steps. I cried and cried and cried, and I called my husband, and it was the middle of the night, literally the middle of the night in Canada, so that he could witness this with me, and he was so excited. And that pride is no different, regardless of whether you gave birth to your child or not. The pride of a parent is the pride of a parent, and that is something that has been unwavering every single little step, every single little development between him and my daughter, who came home afterwards, is just so overwhelming, and is one of the best feelings I've ever experienced. But the other part, just like every other parent, when you're an adoptive parent, you go through the sleepless nights and the tantrums and the wanting to pull your hair out, and it's the hardest job in the world. And I have a 2 and a 3-year-old, so energy out the kazoo, just non-stop energy. And I live in a foreign country by myself with my 2 kids, and there's a lot of obstacles that I deal with, and sometimes their energy I don't match. And so that is challenging. But again, doesn't matter if I gave birth to them or not, it's going to be the same. And so they run me ragged. I love them to pieces, but they run me ragged. But then there's also this intent, you still have that connection with them. And I think that before my kids came home, I always assumed adoptive parents had strong connections with their kids. But I always just kind of assumed there was going to be a difference, that when you grow a child inside of you and give birth to it, that there's just that innate bond. And there is, that it's a little bit different with adoptive children at first. But over time, that connection develops. And if you're lucky enough, like we were, to actually know both our kids and to choose our children as much as they chose us, to know them before they came home and to develop a connection with them before they came home. So when they came home, they felt safe and secure already. That connection does develop, and it's intense. And especially between me and my son, I find that because we have those first few months by ourselves, just the two of us, the connection between us, is just intense. And I can't imagine it being any more intense, so I assume it's very similar, if not the same, as with a biological parent. So I mean, the things that make us parents to the core is the same, whether you're a biological parent or an adoptive parent. But then there's some major differences, which I wasn't as aware of as I am now after I adopted. So my husband and I always knew that we would adopt, whether or not we had biological children as well or not. We always knew we would adopt. Because of that, we've always just been aware of other people who've adopted and wanting to know about their stories. We've always been really inquisitive as to how their relationships work. I've read books about it just to sort of prepare ourselves for what it would be like. And I really don't think there was a single book that could have prepared me, because for us, so again, our story is that we lived in the country that we adopted from. So we didn't do the typical international adoption where you do it all from home. Which often takes longer, and there's all of the stresses associated with that. But then you basically go for a court day, you bring your child home, so maybe 1 or 2 trips to the country. So a lot of it's done from home, where you have your own support system and your support network at home while you're dealing with all of the trials of adoption. For us, we were doing it in Uganda, where we didn't have a very big support network. Creating friends in an environment where you know it's transient, so everyone's coming and going, and you sort of know they're going to come, but then likely those friendships won't last, or you're not going to see each other as often. It's just the connections aren't nearly as deep as back home, and so we really felt like we were kind of going through it alone. We were really in the trenches alone. And so when my husband, after the first year of being here, which was all we had planned for our NGO, when he had to go home in order to work for us to be able to stay for the kids, I was by myself. And so all of the trials and the really hard moments of being an adoptive parent, I dealt with completely alone. And that was hard. And so one of the biggest difference, I think, between being an adoptive parent and a biological parent is that bonding that we think is immediate because you know they're going to be your children isn't necessarily. So again, my children came home when they were 2 and 3 years old, and we did know them before that. So we've known Abel, my son, since he was approximately 1 year old, and we knew Malika, our daughter, since she was about 1.5. And so because of that, we did have a connection with them. But going to the orphanage, you have such strict regulations as to the relationship you're allowed to have. You constantly have people telling you how much time you can spend together, where you're allowed to go. There's so many other kids always around that you want to share your attention with, because they also want attention and love. And so you feel almost bad giving one-on-one attention to your kids, even though you know they're going to be yours. And so the bond is more of like, I would compare it almost like an auntie that you have when they're in the orphanage, because even though you're starting to love them intensely, I love my nieces and nephews intensely. So I would say that when my kids came home, it was almost that kind of relationship where it was like the fun aunt, because I would go to the orphanage and my husband would come, and we would be like, they get so excited to see us, and we'd try to cram all this love and attention into the short period of time that we had together. And so kind of like I would do with my nieces and nephews, right? But when they came home, I think for both parties, the kids and us, it was a little bit of an awakening, because that really fun-loving, easy relationship you have in the orphanage has to change, because now you're their parent. You're trying to keep them alive. You're trying to raise them into good human beings that aren't going to just annoy everyone. So you have rules in place. You have guidelines that the kids don't necessarily, they've never seen you in that role. So that's a little bit tricky. But when they first come home, the bonding, you have to now sort of take it from that level of aunt, uncle to parent. And I don't know for certain if this is true, because the oldest child I had was 3. But for us, the younger, like Abel was younger, and because he was cognitively delayed, he was much younger even in mentality than Malika was when she came home. And it was much easier to bond with Abel compared to Malika because he sort of just trusted me because it was like, okay, this is a person taking care of me. He trusted me. And there was this mutual bond pretty quick. Within the first month, I would say, there was that bond really quickly. With Malika, she has more years of mistrust and abuse. And our daughter was born without hands. So she was always sort of exploited for her entire life. And in her home, originally, where she was removed from, as well as in the baby home, where people would come just to see her. And she was sort of this like exhibit at the baby home. I hate using that word, but really, it was an exploitation. They don't see it that way, obviously, but it really was. And when we would come and there would be people there, funders who wanted to see her and take pictures with her, I was forced to sit back and watch. And even if she wanted to come to me and she'd be crying because she'd see me, I would get in trouble and she would be held from me because she needed to go for pictures with these people who were there, who were the supporters. And so that was really, really hard. And I think when she came home, it took a while for us to sort of get to really build a trusting relationship. Also, she wasn't punished or disciplined really at all at the baby home because everyone always wanted to keep her happy and everyone sort of felt bad for her when they came to the volunteers and things. And even the mothers or the mamas who took care of the kids there sort of just always spoiled her because they wanted her to always be happy. And so when she came home and there were rules and guidelines, she didn't like that and she pushed back a lot. And as a 3-year-old already in the stage where they start pushing back and pushing boundaries and being a little bit deceptive in some ways, she had that already going naturally for her, plus coming into an environment where now there's rules and regulations. So it's been a lot harder for that connection to form because I felt like I had to go from this fun-loving aunt to really a strict parent almost more with her because she was already getting into things and doing things, whereas Abel was more of a baby. So it was more of a gradual development. So I think that the bonding is definitely different with adoptive parents. With age, it makes a difference. It's not like they walk into your house and instantly there's a bond between a parent and a child. It takes time. And Malika's been home for 9.5 months now, almost 10 months. And we still work on it. I mean, there's days where we're really, really connected, and there's days where we're not. And so we're working on it, and I know with time it will get better and stronger, but it's not just this instinctive, well, now that someone calls you a parent, now the switch is flipped. It's not true. And so you work at it just like any relationship, and as they get older, I think that does also play a factor. The other really cool thing about being an adoptive parent, at least in our case, is that we got to choose our kids. And so, I mean, don't get me wrong, biological parents, I know I've never met a bio parent that said, I wish I could have had a different kid than the kid I got. But it's really cool to be able to go into an orphanage with tons of kids and to bond with certain kids more or to have that connection with kids. I mean, my daughter and husband bonded immediately. Like, I'm talking minutes after her walking through the door of that orphanage. She was attached to him like I've never seen since then with her, with anyone. And he was attached to her. And he is more of a reserved person. He doles out his love to certain people. And when you're in his inner circle, you're there for life. But he's not just a person that opens his heart really easily. And with her, it was instantaneous. Instantaneous. And even though we weren't planning on adopting, I had to keep telling him, like, keep your heart in check. Don't get too attached because we're trying to help these kids, but don't get so attached that it's going to hurt a lot when they go to a different home. And so she chose him as much as he chose her. And with Abel, it was the same with him and I, where I started out wanting to help him and get him into a family, and it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that he was meant to be our son. And he developed an intense bond with me because he was pretty severely neglected in the baby home and didn't have a lot of strong attachments. So because of that, I was one of the first strong attachments he formed. And so we had a really, really intense connection. So he chose me as much as I chose him in that situation. And that's a really cool factor when you're an adoptive parent that not everyone gets to. Some people get matched with their children. But for us, at least, we got to really choose, and they chose us back. So it made it a lot easier to forming that family unit once we were all home. The other thing that comes into play with any child, any adoptive child that comes, essentially that's older than a newborn, that bio parents don't deal with as much, is the trauma that children come with. And so every child that's lived in an orphanage or who's been abandoned by their parents or who's been made to feel like they're unworthy or unloved comes with trauma and baggage that you have to work through. And our son came home um, with a lot of trauma tantrums where he would just start screaming. And I could never figure out what it was. At first, it took time to figure out what was causing these tantrums. For him, a lot of them were physiotherapy induced because there were physiotherapists at the baby home that would work with him. But they would place him in positions and basically leave him there until his muscles would hurt so bad that he would scream. So any of the normal exercises that we had to do with him, like to get him to walk. So for instance, holding his leg and getting him to stand up from the bottom, that was something they did. And if I made him squat, he would scream. He didn't crawl ever because they would put him in the crawling position until he would scream. So he went from bum scooching to walking because I could never put him in the crawling position. And so there were these challenges right away with him. Eating was another one that they thought he was being stubborn, and that's why he wasn't eating. It's really because he didn't have the muscle development or teeth. But because he was 1.5 years old, they assumed he was just being stubborn and refusing to eat. So they would force feed him solid food sometimes. And I watched it happen numerous times where he would start choking. And so I would have to backslap him. And so they would either just get mad and just refuse to feed him they just give him porridge, which then meant he wasn't getting the nutrients he needed. And then when we started bringing the pureed baby foods for him, we sort of got reprimanded for bringing foods that no one else had. And so when he came home, if I gave him anything that wasn't liquid, I mean a pea that I knew he couldn't choke on, he would scream. And I actually had to tickle his tongue so that he would be forced to swallow whatever was in his mouth so he would feel that he wasn't going to choke, and then he would eat the rest. So we had to go from that to now having a 2.5-year-old who garburates everything and eats anything that he sees. But they come with traumas that you have to work through. And when you get a newborn baby, whether it's adopted or not, when they come newborn to you, you start at ground zero. You know everything that's happened to that child, so you know what's likely happening. I mean, there's some children that come with fetal alcohol syndrome or other conditions that happen during pregnancy that you see later in life. But a lot of those trauma-induced physical moments in their life, you've been there for all of them, so you know what they are, you know why they're there, and often you can work through them better because you know your child from day one. And so I think that that's another huge thing that adoptive parents deal with, is just working through traumas, figuring out why they're there. And that can be really hard and frustrating, especially for us doing it here without support, without anyone to really be like, okay, can you just come in? I just need one night. You never really had that. So there were definitely moments where I didn't deal with situations in the best way. I became more angry than I should have, or I would snap and yell instead of being able to really help him through a moment because I was just so exhausted and overwhelmed by the whole situation. Because again, I think I assumed he was going to come home and it was just going to be this perfect little fairy tale. We waited for kids for so long that when I felt like I was doing everything I could and giving everything I could to him, he would still scream and yell, and it wasn't enough. And for me, someone who likes control and things to be a certain way, it was very hard for me to know that I couldn't do it. I couldn't make him happy, and that was really hard for me to work through in my own situation. So then there's sort of a whole other side to this, is that as a biological parent, your children look like you. People know they're your kids. When you're out in public, people don't stare because you just sort of fit in. You're just, unless you have a child that's 10 feet tall or something, normally people aren't staring, you just kind of blend in. When you have adoptive kids, yes, we live in Uganda and we're white with black kids. So yes, people stare at us and make really inappropriate comments and say horrible things and make it really hard for us sometimes and hard for the kids. But my understanding from talking to other adoptive parents is that's not something that changes when you go back to North America. That when your kids look different from you, people constantly think it's their right to ask questions that are really personal. And sometimes people do it in this great way and really inquisitive, nice way. And other times people are really rude about it, or they won't say anything, they just stare. And so not only as adoptive parents do you have to have that conversation with your kids about why we look different and you came from another lady's tummy, but you have other people, and it's often adults, saying things that then make them have questions and make them uncomfortable. And that's not right either. And that's one of the things that I think is one of the biggest challenges of being an adoptive parent is you love your kid like you gave birth to them, but people don't let you live that truth sometimes, and they want to constantly know your story. And I think that people don't realize that as an adoptive parent, you very rarely can leave the house without people either staring at your kids or asking questions. You can't just go out for a nice meal without the waitress wanting to know about where the kids come from or how you ended up with them. And so I think that as adoptive parents, you sort of have to share your life more, you share your children almost more with other people, complete strangers, than you do when you have a biological child. And I'm going to actually talk on that in the next video a little more about just like some of the things people do and say that they don't realize might be offensive, some things that really help when you've gone through adoptions, and some things that aren't necessarily so great. And so sort of also with that, when you have a biological child, you spend your time, and I know this because I see my brothers and sisters doing with their kids, and I do it with their kids, where you're always looking for resemblances, like, oh, they got this from that parent, or oh, they got the nose from this, or oh, that's this person's personality, and oh, they're a spitfire like grandma. But when you have adoptive kids, there's always just this question in the back of your mind of, if you don't know the biological parents, I wonder where they got that. I can't tell you how many times I look at my kids and wonder, not necessarily about physical appearances as much, I don't think, as like personal characteristics. So like my son is hilarious, and he's been that way since he was little, like just a little clown. And I've often wondered, I wonder if either of his parents were really comedic and funny, or if this is just something that's developed in him. My daughter is very meticulous and very, she's a perfectionist, and there's those moments that I wonder, is she getting that from watching me, or is she getting it, is that something that was innate in her? Like those things that, because you don't know the biological parents, you question it and you wonder, and not in a bad way, just inquisitive. But there's just a lot more questions, I guess, when you don't know the biological family, and you sort of just create in your head what they're like. And every time we are on a bus going back in the direction that my son is from in Western Uganda, I will literally look for people on the bus that look like him and wonder if they're from his family. And in Uganda, it's all by clans, so clans and regions. And so whenever I find people who tell me they're from the same district that my son is from, I get so excited, because I think, there might be some sort of connection, and they'll speak Ankoli to him, which is the language that he would have spoken in that area of Uganda. And it's so exciting, and I'll take pictures of him with these people, so there's a connection. And my daughter, we know her actual clan because we know some of her biological family. So when someone will say, when she gives her names, her name is reflective of her clan. And so her middle name, when she says it and someone's like, hey, that's my clan too, we get super excited, because again, there's that connection that you just want to know your kids' families. You want to know a connection there. And again, a little different, I think, between biological and adoptive parents. And then along with that is that question of how much do you include the biological family, if they want to be included, if they don't, how much, and those questions that you always have to deal with for your child's entire life of, when do you tell them for us it's obvious they're adopted, they're going to always know that, but when do you talk to them about adoption? When do you talk to them about their biological family? For our son, we have no idea who his family was. He was abandoned on a bus. For our daughter, we know who her family was, but her family believed she was a curse because she didn't have hands, and so they didn't want her. And how do you tell a child that? And when do you tell a child that? And so I think for us, we're worried about more. Right now, we're working on building her self-esteem and her confidence, so she knows how incredible she is. So when she finds that out, she'll see it as people who just didn't quite understand and didn't know how incredible she was, but that they loved her enough to let her go to a better family, because there's a lot of worse things that could have happened in that situation by her family. So anyway, so there's obviously tons of differences between being a biological parent and an adoptive parent, but the most important thing always is that the biggest similarity between all parents is we love our kids unconditionally. We would do anything for them, including sleepless nights and driving all over high heaven for them, doing anything that they need, dropping anything at the drop of a hat for them. And so that is what unites us all as parents. But I just thought it was really important for just that conversation to be had about the differences, because there are some major differences that I don't think people are so aware of anyway. So until next time, and next time I want to talk about just some of the things that people say, sometimes unmeaning to be rude, and other times I think intentional, and also just the things that are really, really helpful from friends and family, for people who may be newly adopted, or even those who've had kids in their life for a long time, and just to know how to connect with those people. So anyway, talk to you soon.